On the night of May 30th, 1942, Wing Commander Guy Gibson sat in the cockpit of his Lancaster bomber at RAF Firestone, waiting for takeoff clearance. Around him, 1,046 aircraft were preparing to launch the largest bombing raid in history. The target was Cologne, Germany's fourth-largest city. The operation was codenamed Millennium. Gibson was 23 years old. He had been flying combat missions since the war began. He had bombed targets in daylight and darkness, in clear weather and in clouds. He had seen crews disappear, aircraft shot down, missions abort. But this night was different. For the first time, Bomber Command was testing a revolutionary approach to night warfare, one that would transform how modern militaries strike in darkness. The Germans believed their cities were virtually invulnerable to nighttime attack. They had good reason for this confidence. Since 1940, German air defenses had evolved into the most sophisticated system ever created. They called it the Kammhuber Line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, who designed it. The system stretched from Denmark to Switzerland, a defensive network of radar stations, searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters that had proven devastatingly effective against RAF night bombers. The foundation of this system was radar. The Germans had developed Würzburg radar, a ground-based system that could track incoming bombers at ranges up to 40 miles with remarkable accuracy. Each Würzburg radar guided a specific night fighter to its target. The sky over Germany was divided into boxes, each box monitored by its own radar station. When bombers entered a box, the radar would vector a single night fighter to intercept them. The system was methodical, efficient, deadly. The night fighters themselves represented the pinnacle of aerial technology. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88 were equipped with their own airborne radar systems, Liechtenstein radar that could detect bombers from several miles away. German pilots like Helmut Lent and Heinrich Prinz zu Sein-Wittgenstein had perfected the art of night interception. They would approach from below and behind, invisible against the dark earth, targeting the bombers' fuel tanks and bomb bay with upward-firing cannons in a tactic called Schräge Musik, jazz music. Between the radar stations and the night fighters stood the flak. German 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft guns formed a dense protective umbrella over every major city. These guns fired radar-predicted barrages that could throw up a curtain of steel through which no aircraft could safely pass. Each shell was fused to explode at specific altitudes, creating airbursts that could shred aircraft 100 feet away. The searchlights completed the system. Master searchlights were radar-directed, locking onto bombers with startling accuracy. Once illuminated by the master beam, dozens of other searchlights would converge, creating what aircrews called the cone of death. A bomber caught in multiple searchlights became an easy target for flak and night fighters. Escape was nearly impossible once coned. The pilot would throw the aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, diving, climbing, turning, praying that speed and luck would break the beams before the flak found its mark. By 1942, this integrated system was destroying RAF bombers at unsustainable rates. On some missions, 5% to 7% of aircraft failed to return. With each crew flying a 30-mission tour, the mathematics were grim. Statistically, crews had less than a 50% chance of surviving. Some squadrons lost half their aircraft in a single month. The young men flying these missions knew their odds. They flew anyway. RAF Bomber Command's attempts to overcome these defenses had been failing. The strategy in 1940 and 1941 was to send bombers individually or in small groups to multiple targets. This dispersed approach meant bombers encountered the German defenses spread across the entire Kammhuber Line. Each bomber faced the full attention of whatever radar, fighters, and flak occupied that particular defensive box. The Germans had time to track, intercept, and destroy bombers one by one throughout the night. Navigation was another critical problem. Finding targets in complete darkness proved nearly impossible. Bombers would fly for hours over blacked-out Germany, navigators trying to identify cities and factories by dead reckoning. occasional glimpses of rivers or coastlines, and tremendous amounts of hope. Many crews never found their primary targets. They would bomb what they thought was the target, or drop their bombs on any lights they saw, or bring their bombs home rather than waste them on empty fields. Post-raid analysis in 1941 revealed a humiliating truth. The Butt Report, named for a civil servant in the War Cabinet Secretariat, analyzed photographs taken by bombers during attacks. The findings were devastating. Only 1/3 of aircraft claiming to have hit their targets actually dropped bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. Over the heavily defended Ruhr industrial region, the figure dropped to 1/10. Bombing accuracy was so poor that crews were essentially hitting random locations across Germany, causing minimal damage while suffering terrible casualties. The man responsible for changing this situation was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who took command of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942. Harris was 49 years old, a veteran of World War I air combat, and a true believer in strategic bombing. He was convinced that bombing could win the war by destroying German industry, demoralizing the civilian population, and forcing surrender without requiring a costly ground invasion. But he knew the current methods were failing. Harris understood that survival depended on overwhelming the German defenses rather than avoiding them. The Kammhuber Line was designed to handle bombers arriving individually or in small groups. Each defensive box could manage perhaps 2 or 3 intercepts per hour. But what if hundreds of bombers arrived simultaneously, flooding every defensive box, saturating the system beyond its capacity? This was the theory behind Operation Millennium. Harris scraped together every available aircraft, 1,047 bombers from 53 squadrons. He included training units, aircraft under repair, bombers that should have been grounded for maintenance. Every crew that could fly was ordered to Cologne. The stream of aircraft would pass over the target in just 90 minutes. The German defenses would face not a steady trickle of targets, but a devastating flood. The raid began at 12:47 a.m. on May 31st. The first wave of bombers, Wellingtons and Sterlings, carried incendiaries designed to start fires that would mark the target for following waves. Behind them came Hamptons, Manchesters, Halifaxes, and Lancasters, carrying high explosive bombs to blow buildings apart and spread the fires. The bomber stream was 70 miles long, a river of aircraft flowing toward Cologne. The Pathfinder aircraft, specially trained crews with the best navigational equipment, found Cologne easily. The Rhine River gleamed in the moonlight. The cathedral's twin spires were unmistakable landmarks. They dropped their incendiaries in the old city center. Within minutes, fires were burning bright enough to be seen from 100 miles away. Following bombers needed no sophisticated navigation. They simply aimed for the glow on the horizon. For the German defenders, it was chaos. Radar operators watched their screens fill with contacts. There were too many targets to track. Night fighter controllers tried to vector their aircraft to intercepts, but became overwhelmed. Fighters would be directed to one bomber only to have 3 others pass nearby. Radio frequencies became jammed with traffic. The system that worked perfectly against small raids collapsed under the weight of numbers. The searchlight batteries fired their beams into the night, catching bombers in their glare. But there were so many aircraft that holding one meant letting 10 others pass. Flak guns fired continuously until their barrels overheated. Shell bursts lit the sky like fireworks. Bombers flew through the flak storm, some struck and falling, others continuing through to drop their bombs. The city below disappeared under a blanket of smoke and flame. The statistics from that night told the story. In 90 minutes, 868 aircraft dropped 1,455 tons of bombs on Cologne. 2/3 of the city center was destroyed. 45,000 people were made homeless, and 469 people were killed. The raid caused more damage in one night than all previous raids on Cologne combined. More importantly, RAF losses were far lower than expected. Only 41 aircraft failed to return, a loss rate of just 3.9%. The Germans had learned a terrible lesson. Their defenses, designed to handle scattered attacks, could not cope with concentrated bomber streams. The Kammhuber Line had been breached not by superior technology, but by overwhelming numbers arriving simultaneously. German air defense commanders knew they had to adapt quickly or watch their cities burn. They began modifications immediately. Additional radar stations were deployed. Night fighter units were expanded and repositioned. New tactics were developed for mass raid scenarios. But each German adaptation forced another British innovation. What followed was an escalating technological and tactical competition that would define night warfare for the rest of the war. One critical British innovation was the Pathfinder Force, officially established in August 1942. These were elite crews selected for their superior navigation skills and bombing accuracy. They would arrive first at the target, mark it with colored flares and incendiaries, then guide the main force to the correct aiming point. The Pathfinders flew the most dangerous missions, arriving alone or in small numbers before the bomber stream's protective mass effect took hold. Wing Commander Donald Bennett commanded the Pathfinder Force. Bennett was Australian, 32 years old, and already legendary for his navigational expertise and survival skills. He had been shot down over Norway in 1942, escaped capture, and made his way back to Britain through Sweden. Under his leadership, the Pathfinders developed increasingly sophisticated marking techniques. Early targets used sky markers, flares suspended by parachute. Later raids employed ground markers that burned intensely for minutes, creating clearly visible aiming points. The Germans responded by creating decoy fires away from real targets. Entire teams were dedicated to starting fires in fields and empty areas, hoping to draw bombers away from cities. They lit decoy factories made of wood and canvas. They created fake railways and airfields with lights that appeared identical to the real installations from altitude. British crews had to distinguish between genuine Pathfinder markers and German deception, a challenge that required skill, experience, and luck. Then came radar countermeasures. In July 1943, Bomber Command deployed Window, what Americans called chaff. These were thin strips of aluminum foil cut to precise lengths that matched German radar wavelengths. When dropped from aircraft, Window created thousands of false radar returns. German radar screens became useless, filled with contacts that made tracking individual bombers impossible. The first use of Window was during Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg. On the night of July 24, 1943, 791 bombers attacked Hamburg, dropping Window continuously throughout their flight. German radar operators watched helplessly as their screens filled with snow. Night fighters could not be directed to targets they could not see. Searchlight operators found themselves illuminating empty sky or their own aircraft. The flak prediction systems failed completely. Hamburg burned for 8 days. The combination of high explosives and incendiaries created a firestorm, a phenomenon where fires became so intense they generated their own weather system. Winds of over 150 miles per hour rushed toward the fire center, feeding oxygen to flames that reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets melted. People in air raid shelters suffocated as fires consumed all available oxygen. Between 37,000 and 43,000 people died, most in a single night, July 27th to 28th. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, would later write that 6 more Hamburg-scale raids would have forced Germany to surrender. The industrial and psychological damage was that severe. But the Germans adapted again. They modified their radar to different frequencies that Window could not jam. They developed new tactics for their night fighters that relied less on ground control. They trained pilots to hunt independently, following the bomber stream, picking off stragglers and damaged aircraft. The British introduced H-2S radar, an airborne system that created a rough map of the ground below. Rivers, coastlines, and cities produced different radar returns, allowing navigators to identify targets, even through clouds and smoke. This was revolutionary. For the first time, bombers could navigate and bomb accurately in any weather. The system was not perfect. The radar images were difficult to interpret, requiring skilled operators who could distinguish between German cities that looked similar on radar screens. H-2S also had a fatal weakness. It transmitted a signal that German night fighters could detect at long range. Fighters equipped with Naxos receivers would follow H-2S transmissions directly to British bombers. The very technology that helped bombers find their targets also led fighters to the bombers. Crews had to balance the navigational advantage against the increased risk of interception. Another innovation was the Monica tail warning radar, designed to alert crews when enemy fighters approached from behind. The system would emit an audio tone that increased in pitch as the threat closed. In theory, it gave gunners precious seconds to prepare for combat. In practice, German fighters developed Flensburg receivers that homed on Monica transmissions. British bombers equipped with defensive radar were actually more vulnerable to attack than those without it. The electronic warfare dimension of night bombing became a deadly game of measure and countermeasure. By 1944, British night bombing tactics had evolved into a sophisticated system. Operations began with mosquito bombers, fast twin-engine aircraft that could outrun most fighters, flying diversionary raids to draw German defenses away from the real target. Pathfinder Force would follow, marking the target with different colored flares for the 3 waves that would attack at precisely timed intervals. The main force would arrive in a bomber stream compressed in time and space to saturate defenses. The bomber stream itself became a weapon. By concentrating hundreds of aircraft in a corridor just a few miles wide and passing over the target in 15 to 20 minutes, Bomber Command ensured that German fighters could make only 1 or 2 intercepts before the stream passed. Night fighter pilots described it as trying to fish in a river with their bare hands. Bombers flowed past too quickly to catch them all. The British also developed master bomber techniques, where a senior pilot orbited the target throughout the raid, directing following waves via radio. The master bomber could assess whether the target was adequately marked, order re-marking if necessary, and adjust the attack plan in real time. This was extraordinarily dangerous. The master bomber orbited a heavily defended target for up to 30 minutes, while flak and fighters tried to kill him. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, who had led Operation Millennium over Cologne, would later command the most famous precision night attack of the war, Operation Chastise, the Dam Busters raid. That mission on May 16 to 17, 1943, demonstrated that properly trained crews could execute complex night operations with precision that seemed impossible in 1940. Using specially designed bouncing bombs, 19 Lancasters attacked 3 Ruhr dams, flying at exactly 60 feet above water in complete darkness. 2 dams were breached, but the cost was severe. 8 aircraft were lost, 53 men killed. Success, even in night operations, still required sacrifice. The ultimate achievement of RAF night bombing came from lessons learned through terrible trial and error. Bomber Command suffered over 55,500 dead during the war, a mortality rate higher than any British service except Coastal Command submarines. For every successful raid that destroyed a German city or factory, there were missions that failed completely, where navigation errors meant bombs fell on empty countryside or friendly territory. The moral dimension of night bombing remains contested. The destruction of Hamburg, Dresden, and other German cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Whether this constituted legitimate strategic warfare or war crimes is debated by historians. Air Chief Marshal Harris believed firmly that destroying German cities would break civilian morale and force surrender. That belief proved partially incorrect. German civilians, like British civilians during the Blitz, endured bombing with remarkable resilience. But the industrial damage was real and significant. German factories were destroyed or damaged. Transportation networks were disrupted. Critical industries like ball bearing production, synthetic oil, and aircraft manufacturing were degraded. The German economy diverted massive resources to air defense, resources that could have been used on the Eastern Front. Over 1 million people were employed in air raid protection services. Millions more were engaged in repairing damage and clearing rubble. The final statistics reveal the scale of the night air war. Between 1939 and 1945, RAF Bomber Command flew 387,416 sorties and dropped 955,044 tons of bombs on Germany. Peak operations in 1944 and 1945 saw 1,000 bomber raids become routine rather than exceptional. The forces that struggled to find Cologne in 1940 were, by 1945, striking specific factories, marshalling yards, and military installations with devastating accuracy in complete darkness and through cloud cover. The Germans never found an adequate counter to the evolved British night bombing tactics. They deployed increasing numbers of night fighters, over 2,000 by war's end. They developed radar sets that could see through window and track low-flying aircraft. They trained pilots to exceptional standards, creating night fighter aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who claimed 121 night victories. But none of this could stop the bombing. The cities burned, the factories closed, the transportation system collapsed. Post-war analysis showed that the combination of strategic bombing and Soviet advances from the east created an impossible situation for Germany. They could not simultaneously rebuild destroyed industries, fight a multi-front war, and maintain civilian morale under continuous bombardment. The night sky over Germany, once considered a safe refuge where defenses made attack suicidal, became a highway for hundreds of British bombers, delivering destruction with industrial efficiency. The lessons learned over Germany's night sky revolutionized aerial warfare. Modern air forces recognize that achieving air superiority at night requires integrating technology, tactics, and training. The electronic warfare techniques developed during the bombing campaign, radar jamming, radar homing missiles, form the foundation of contemporary air combat. The concept of overwhelming defenses through concentration of force remains central to military planning. The veterans of RAF Bomber Command carried mixed feelings about their service. They had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the military, knowing their chances of survival were statistically poor. They watched friends die, aircraft explode, crews disappear into the darkness never to return. They saw the photographs of German cities reduced to rubble. Some felt pride in their contribution to victory. Others struggled with guilt about the civilians they killed. Most simply did what was asked of them and tried to survive. For decades, Bomber Command veterans received little recognition. The British government, uncomfortable with the moral dimensions of strategic bombing, declined to issue a specific campaign medal. Veterans felt their sacrifice was being forgotten or actively ignored. It was not until 2012, 67 years after the war ended, that a memorial to Bomber Command was unveiled in Green Park, London. The memorial lists the names of 55,573 airmen who died. Former crew members, many in their 90s, attended the dedication, finally receiving the recognition they deserved. The technical innovations developed during the night bombing campaign influenced post-war aviation. Radar navigation systems evolved into the GPS technology we use today. Electronic countermeasures became standard equipment on military aircraft. Pathfinder techniques for marking targets informed modern precision strike operations. The idea that darkness provided concealment for attackers rather than defenders transformed how militaries think about night operations. The story of RAF Bomber Command's night war over Germany is ultimately about adaptation. It is about taking terrible casualties, learning from failure, developing new technology and tactics, then trying again. The Germans believed their defenses made their cities invulnerable to night attack. They were wrong. British crews, most of them volunteers in their early 20s, proved that determination combined with innovation could overcome any defense. When Wing Commander Guy Gibson took off for Cologne on that May night in 1942, leading the largest raid in history, he was testing whether concentration of force could overwhelm sophisticated defenses. The answer was yes. When Bomber Command deployed Window over Hamburg in 1943, blinding German radar, they proved that technological innovation could neutralize defensive systems overnight. When Pathfinders marked targets with increasing accuracy through 1944 and 1945, they demonstrated that practice, training, and courage could turn night bombing from a desperate gamble into a precision weapon. The German cities that were considered protected by the world's best air defenses fell to an enemy that refused to accept that protection as permanent. RAF Bomber Command learned to strike in complete darkness, through weather that grounded other aircraft, against defenses that killed thousands of their comrades. They learned because they had to. They learned because the alternative was losing the war. They learned because young men, knowing the odds, climbed into their aircraft night after night and flew into the darkness over Germany. That is the story of how RAF Bomber Command learned to fight at night. Not through inspiration or genius, but through sacrifice, adaptation, and the courage of crews who kept flying even when mathematics said they would not survive. The darkness that once protected German cities became their greatest vulnerability, and the British bombers, guided by innovation and determination, found their way through that darkness to deliver a contribution to victory that, whatever its moral complexity, cannot be denied its historical significance. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. These forgotten details from World War II deserve to be remembered. Subscribe for more untold histories from the darkness of the Second World War. Each one matters. Each one teaches lessons about innovation, sacrifice, and the evolution of warfare. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping us preserve these stories.